Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into Ezra chapter 5. We've been looking at some material covering this part of the story.
That's right. And it focuses on, that moment when God's people in Jerusalem started rebuilding the temple again, but then, bang, more opposition.
Yeah, exactly. So our aim for this deep dive is to unpack how they handled that renewed pushback. And honestly, to see what lessons are in there for you when you face obstacles in what you're trying to do.
It really is a story of starts and stops, isn't it? But also about kind of sticking with it. Let's dig in and see, what it takes to stay focused when things get tough.
Okay, so let's set the scene. End of Ezra chapter 4. Things looked pretty bleak for the temple project, right?
Oh, totally. King Artaxerxes had issued that decree, and the work just stopped, completely ground to a halt.
And the people, they'd sort of scattered, gone back home, and started building their own houses instead. The temple was, left behind, forgotten almost.
Yeah, that royal command must have felt pretty final. It's easy to see how they get sidetracked, Focus on their own homes, their own security.
They had the instruction to rebuild, but, earthly power seemed to have won that round.
Seemed to.
But that wasn't the end of it. Our source material points out that God intervened. He sent prophets, Haggai and Zechariah.
Right, specifically sent to stir the people up, to challenge where their focus was, call them back to God's house.
And this is where things really pivot. The leaders, Zerubbabel, he's the governor, the political guy, and Jeshua, the high priest.
They listened.
Yes,
Yeah.
They actually listened to the prophets. They didn't argue, they didn't delay. They just heard God's word through Haggai and Zechariah, and, they acted.
Ezra 5.2 says it plainly. They began rebuilding the house of God. Just like that.
Didn't wait for the politics to change or anything, just obeyed God's message. And I love this detail. The source highlights the prophets weren't just shouting from the sidelines.
No, they were with them, helping out. It was this, partnership. Spiritual encouragement and practical work hand in hand.
That immediate obedience, backed up by the prophets being right there, that feels key. It's different from before, isn't it?
Totally different. Last time, a political problem stopped them flat. This time, they moved forward because God said so, before getting any human permission. It kind of suggests they'd learned something painful from that earlier stoppage.
Yeah, they saw what happened when they put the king's word over God's. This time, God says go, and they just go.
And, as often happens when God's work gets going again.
Trouble shows up, right on schedule. The text says almost as soon as they started laying stones again, boom, here comes Tatnai, the governor from across the Euphrates, and Jethar-Boznai, and, their whole crew.
It's such a common pattern, isn't it? God's work gains traction and opposition pops up. It's almost predictable.
And their questions are pointed, very specific.
Yeah, straight to the point. Who gave you permission to rebuild this house and finish this wall?
And then, what are the names of the men putting up this building?
They're probing, aren't they? Looking for the authority, looking for the key people. Probably hoping to shut it down just like before.
It's that same tactic. Use the rules, the administration, to stop God's plans.
And it makes you think, doesn't it? When you feel God telling you to do something, to step out, are you ready for that pushback? Because it often comes. This isn't just ancient history.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial bit, the thing that makes this time different from chapter 4, Ezra 5, verse 5. The game changer.
The work doesn't stop this time. And why? The text just says it so simply. But the eye of their God was on the leaders of the Judeans.
That one line changes everything. Because God was watching over them. These local officials, Tatnai and his guys, they couldn't just shut it down on the spot.
Right. They were sort of restrained. The whole thing had to go up the chain of command all the way to King Darius in Persia. They had to wait for an official ruling, in writing. So the people kept going. While that letter was being drafted, while it was traveling, while everyone was waiting, the building continued in Jerusalem.
That's the huge difference. Last time, the decree stopped them immediately. This time, they kept working, even with the opposition breathing down their necks and asking questions.
It really suggests they'd found a deeper trust, maybe. Learned that waiting for human permission when God says go just leads to, nothing getting done.
Yeah, this time they're leaning on God's command, his presence. The source material really emphasizes that lesson. Listen to God. Trust him. And it's a reminder for us too, right? When God tells you to do something.
He's got his eye on you. He'll watch over you. You can keep going.
That trust fuels everything. Don't let the idea of opposition or how complicated things look paralyze you. His eye is on you.
So Tatnai and his colleagues, they do follow through. They write that letter to King Darius, laying out what they found.
Yep, went straight to the boss. And the report's pretty detailed about what they saw in Judah.
They say they went to the province, to the house of the great god, that's the temple. They described the building work, large stones, timber going into the walls.
And even the opposition couldn't deny the progress, could they?
No, they actually reported the work was being done energetically and making good progress, all under the leader's direction.
That energy, that progress. It speaks volumes about the people's motivation, probably fired up by Haggai and Zechariah.
Definitely. And then Tatnai's letter explains they asked those two key questions. Who gave permission and who are the leaders?
And the source points out the motive there, asking for names, wasn't just record-keeping.
No, it was tactical. They hoped Darius would say, okay, round up those leaders and boom, stop the project by taking out the leadership. Disrupt the momentum. They couldn't stop themselves this time.
Target the leaders, stop the work. Classic strategy.
But the reason the people had that momentum, as the reading says, was that pretty strong message from God by the prophets.
Yeah.
Divine fire fueling human hands.
Okay, so the official report goes off to the king. But the exiles' answer to Tatnai, back in verses 11 to 16, that's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite brilliant.
Oh, yeah. They didn't just give a list of names like Tatnai wanted. They gave him, well, a history lesson.
A history lesson. Tell us about that. What do they say?
Okay, so first, they defined themselves, not just as subjects, but as the servants of the God of heaven and earth. Right away, framing it spiritually, this work answers to a higher authority.
Wow, that's bold. Starting with God.
Then they talked about the building itself. This wasn't some new project. They were rebuilding the house built many years ago by a great king of Israel, Solomon, obviously, giving it historical weight, royal precedent.
Okay, identify themselves, identify the building's history. Then they had to explain. Why was it destroyed in the first place?
And they did, humbly. They said their ancestors had provoked God. And because of that, God handed them over to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who destroyed the temple and took the people into exile. They owned their part in the history.
Owning the failure that led to the destruction. That takes guts, especially when you're trying to justify rebuilding to an official.
It does. But then, having explained the why of the destruction, they pivot to the why of the rebuilding. King Cyrus.
Ah, the original decree.
Exactly. They laid it out. In his first year, Cyrus, king of Babylon himself, gave the authorization to rebuild God's house. This wasn't their idea. It had imperial backing from the start.
And they even mentioned the proof, didn't they? The temple items.
Yes. They pointed out Cyrus returned the gold and silver articles Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Proof positive this wasn't just talk. Cyrus backed it up with tangible actions, restoring sacred things.
And he gave those items to someone specific.
Right, to Sheshbazzar. Cyrus appointed him governor and told him, take these back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple on its original site. Clear instructions, clear chain of command from the previous emperor.
Okay, so what was their final point in this mini history lesson for Tatnai?
They basically said, look, this Sheshbazzar laid the foundation back then, and this project has been ongoing ever since. It's just not finished yet. Connecting their current work directly back to that original authorized start.
So, wow, instead of just names, they gave this whole historical, legal, and theological justification, rooted in God's authority and a past king's decree. And Tatnai put all of that in his letter to Darius.
Which perfectly sets up their own request to Darius in verse 17.
They asked the new king, Darius basically, if you think it's a good idea.
Please check the royal archives in Babylon.
Why Babylon specifically?
Because that's where Cyrus's records, his decrees, would likely be stored. They were asking Darius to verify their claim, find the original decree from Cyrus authorizing the temple rebuild.
And once he found it,
they just asked him to send his decision based on that evidence. They were banking on the fact that the decree did exist and that Darius would respect it.
And this was, politically, super smart. The source material reminds us about Persian law.
Yeah, a law of the Medes and Persians, once made, especially a royal decree, couldn't easily be undone, not even by a later king.
That's the key. Tatnai and the opposition were probably hoping the record was lost or never existed, which would justify stopping the work now. But the Jews knew it was real, and legally it should still stand.
They were appealing over Tatnai's head, straight to the highest law they could invoke, an unchangeable decree from a past emperor, much stronger than just arguing with the local governor.
And here's that core lesson again, right? While all this political chess was being played, letters flying, archives being searched, legal arguments being made, what were God's people doing back in Jerusalem?
They kept building. They didn't put down their hammers to wait for the verdict. They just kept working on the temple.
Focus on the task God gave them. trusting him with the outcome of all the political maneuvering.
Exactly. They persevered through the process, not just waiting for the process to finish.
So let's bring this home. What does this slice of history from Ezra 5 mean for, for you listening today?
Well, the reading draws that parallel pretty clearly. It notes how often we see all kinds of political stuff going on that feels like it's working against God's will.
Yeah, could be big national issues, local community stuff,
Yeah.
even things inside an organization, situations that just seem wrong or aimed against what we feel God wants.
And it's so easy, isn't it, to get sucked into that, to spend all our time worrying about the politics, arguing about it, getting frustrated or anxious about the opposition.
Totally. But the material really frames it as a choice, the same choice that people faced back then. Do we get bogged down in the political stuff, the opposition, the things we can't directly control?
Or do we choose to focus on the task that God has given us?
That feels like the million-dollar question. It's
Yeah.
not saying ignore reality, but where's your primary focus?
Mm.
Where does your energy go when the noise starts?
And the big takeaway from Ezra 5, from this whole deep dive really, seems to be listen for God's direction in your life. Trust him. Really trust him, especially when things get hard or people push back. And then
Keep doing the work.
keep doing the specific work he's called you to do, regardless of the political climate, regardless of the surrounding noise.
It's about knowing what your assignment is. Maybe with your family, your job, your ministry, your community involvement, whatever God's put in front of you. And just sticking to that, trusting his eye is on you while you do it.
Yeah, all those questions from Tatnai, the letters, the waiting for Darius, all that happened around the work. They were real challenges, but they didn't stop the people who decided to obey God first and trust him for protection.
So quite a journey through Ezra 5. We saw people get started again after being discouraged, face that inevitable opposition, but this time stand firm because they trusted God was watching. They gave that amazing historical defense.
And kept building even while the official wheels were turning, appealing to that earlier solid decree.
It really is a powerful example of faith-fueled persistence against pressure.
It is.
Which leaves us and you with maybe one final thought to chew on from this deep dive. Building on that core lesson, what is that specific task that God has given you?
And are you really committed to focusing on that? To keeping at it diligently, even with all the political stuff, the distractions, the opposition, whatever form it takes in your world today? That's a challenge Ezra 5 leaves hanging in the air, isn't it?